The road stretched endlessly before Lucas, illuminated only by the faint glow of his car's headlights cutting through the fog. It was Christmas Eve, and the sky above was blanketed with dark, heavy clouds, threatening to burst open at any moment. His eyes darted to the dashboard, only a few more hours to reach his family's house for the holiday dinner. But something about the road felt off. The radio crackled with static, briefly picking up a Christmas carol before being consumed again by interference. Lucas shifted uncomfortably in his seat, turning the dial, but every station seemed haunted by the same strange static. A sense of isolation began to settle over him as the road became more deserted, not a single car in sight for miles. Glancing in his rearview mirror, he saw nothing but the dark outline of the forest pressing in on both sides of the road. The further he drove, the more alone he felt. He couldn't help but feel like someone or something was watching him, hidden deep in the woods. A cold shiver ran down his spine, and he tightened his grip on the steering wheel, trying to shake off the unsettling thoughts. His phone, lying on the passenger seat, buzzed. He glanced at it. No signal. Typical for these back roads. He sighed, forcing his mind to focus on the warmth and laughter that awaited him at his family's house. His parents, siblings, and even his nieces and nephews would be there. He just had to get through this desolate stretch of road, but as the miles passed, the creeping sense of unease only grew. The trees seemed to close in, their gnarled branches stretching over the road like claws, casting twisted shadows on the asphalt. The fog thickened, making it harder to see beyond the reach of his headlights. A sinking feeling settled in his chest. He'd driven this road many times before, but tonight it felt different, like it had somehow come alive. His eyes flicked to the gas gauge, nearly empty. "Damn it," Lucas muttered under his breath. He should have filled up earlier, but now there was no choice. He needed to find a gas station, and soon. Minutes passed, the needle dipping lower and lower. Just as Lucas was about to give up hope, he saw a faint glow ahead. A gas station, old and worn but functional, standing on the side of the road like a relic from a forgotten time. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. He pulled in, the tires crunching over gravel, and parked next to one of the ancient-looking pumps. The station seemed abandoned, the building itself weathered and worn, with its windows covered in grime. There were no other cars in sight, no signs of life, only the distant hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, barely illuminating the desolate lot. Lucas stepped out of the car, glancing around. The cold air bit at his skin, and the silence was unnerving. He hesitated for a moment before walking over to the pump, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The gas nozzle felt stiff in his hand as he pulled it free and began filling up the tank. That's when he heard it, the faint sound of footsteps on gravel coming from behind him. Lucas froze, his hand tightening around the gas nozzle. The sound of footsteps behind him was unmistakable, slow and deliberate, crunching over the gravel. He turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. Standing at the entrance of the gas station was a man, tall, dressed in an old, weathered uniform that matched the decrepit state of the station. His face was obscured by the shadow cast from the flickering neon sign above, but Lucas could make out a faint, crooked smile. The attendant stood perfectly still, watching him, his presence unnerving in the silence of the night. Lucas cleared his throat, trying to shake off the growing tension. "Hey, I just need some gas," Lucas said, gesturing toward his car. The attendant didn't respond at first, just stood there, his dark eyes glinting strangely in the dim light. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. "Of course," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "But you should be careful on this road." Lucas frowned. "What do you mean?" The man took a slow step forward, the gravel crunching under his boots. "Strange things happen around here, especially at night. You don't want to stay too long." There was something odd about the way the man spoke, something unsettling in his tone. Lucas felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. "I'm just passing through," Lucas replied, forcing a smile, though his nerves were frayed. Got a long drive ahead of me." The attendant took another step forward, his figure now fully illuminated by the flickering neon lights. His face was gaunt, his skin pale, almost sickly, and his eyes seemed to bore into Lucas with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "Then don't keep driving," the man said, his smile fading. "Turn around, go back the way you came." Lucas blinked, confused. "What? I can't just turn around. I'm headed to my family's place. I'm already late." "Doesn't matter," the man interrupted, his voice hardening. "If you keep going, you won't make it." The finality in his tone sent a chill down Lucas's spine. He took a step back, closer to his car, his hand still gripping the nozzle. The attendant was clearly unhinged, talking in riddles. Lucas just needed to get out of here. "Look, I appreciate the warning, but I'll be fine," Lucas said, pulling the nozzle out of his tank and quickly replacing it. He moved toward the driver's side door, glancing over at the man who still stood motionless near the entrance. The attendant's gaze followed him, cold and unwavering. "You've been warned," the man muttered as Lucas opened his car door. "Once you leave here, there's no coming back." Without another word, Lucas slammed the door shut and started the engine, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced one last time at the attendant, who hadn't moved from his spot, still watching him with that strange, almost knowing look in his eyes. Lucas backed out of the station and pulled onto the road, his tires kicking up gravel as he sped away. The eerie atmosphere of the gas station lingered in his mind, but he pushed it aside. The man was probably just some weird local trying to scare off travelers. It didn't matter. He had to get to his family. As the gas station disappeared in his rearview mirror, Lucas shook his head, trying to laugh off the encounter. But deep down, something about the attendant's warning gnawed at him. What did he mean by "no coming back"? Lucas drove for what felt like hours. The rain began to pick up again, pattering against the windshield as his headlights cut through the thick darkness of the road. The trees on either side of the highway loomed like shadowy giants, their branches swaying ominously in the wind. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It read 11:45 p.m. Strange, he thought. He could have sworn it had been later than that when he left the gas station. Shaking his head, he focused back on the road. He was exhausted, and the strange encounter with the attendant still played in his mind. The longer he drove, the more uneasy he felt. The road seemed to stretch on forever, with no other cars, no landmarks, no signs of civilization. It was as if he were driving in circles, yet the road ahead remained straight. The rain intensified, creating a rhythmic tapping on the roof of the car that only added to the unsettling silence. After another hour of driving, Lucas's anxiety began to creep back in. The road hadn't changed. He hadn't seen a single exit or sign, and the trees surrounding him were the same as they had been miles back. He checked the dashboard clock again, 11:45 p.m. His heart skipped a beat. Impossible. He had been driving for over an hour, yet the time hadn't changed at all. Maybe it was a glitch with the clock, a malfunction due to the rain or the cold weather. Still, the unease gnawed at him. Lucas reached for his phone on the passenger seat, hoping to check the time or at least find his location on a map. When he pressed the power button, the screen remained dark. He frowned, pressing it again, harder this time. The phone was dead. "Great," he muttered under his breath, tossing the phone back onto the seat. A sense of isolation began to creep in, heavier with every passing minute. The road, the rain, the trees, all of it felt wrong. He tried to rationalize his growing fear. Maybe he had missed an exit in the rain. Maybe the gas station attendant's cryptic warning had gotten into his head, making him paranoid. But even as he tried to convince himself, his eyes kept darting back to the clock. 11:45 p.m. Lucas gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. Something wasn't right. The time had frozen, the road was endless, and the sense of being trapped began to suffocate him. Up ahead, his headlights caught something on the side of the road, a faint light flickering in the distance. Hope sparked in Lucas's chest. Maybe it was another gas station or a rest stop, a place where he could gather his bearings and figure out what was going on. As he approached, the shape of the building came into focus through the rain. His heart sank. It was the same gas station, Lucas slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the wet asphalt. His eyes were wide, disbelief washing over him. It couldn't be. He had driven for hours. How could he have circled back to the gas station? The familiar flickering neon sign buzzed in the rain, casting a dim glow over the dilapidated pumps. The gravel crunched beneath his tires as he pulled in, his mind racing for explanations that made sense, but none of it did. He parked the car in front of the station, staring at it through the windshield, trying to process what was happening. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. A movement caught his eye. The gas station attendant was standing in the exact same spot, just outside the entrance, watching him. Lucas's blood ran cold. How was this possible? He had left the station hours ago, yet here he was, back where he started, and the attendant hadn't moved an inch. The same vacant, eerie expression on his face, the same unsettling stillness in his posture. Lucas blinked, shaking his head, trying to break free from the surreal feeling that had taken hold of him. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But when the attendant raised his hand and beckoned him forward, Lucas felt the weight of reality sink in. There was no escaping this road. Lucas sat frozen in his car, staring at the gas station attendant through the rain-streaked windshield. The eerie glow of the flickering neon sign reflected in his eyes as his mind scrambled to make sense of what he was seeing. It was impossible. He had driven for hours, yet he had somehow returned to the same place. His heart pounded in his chest as he considered his options. The attendant stood still, his hand raised in the same beckoning gesture. There was no urgency in his movements, but his presence felt oppressive, like the man knew something Lucas didn't. The fear that had been simmering under the surface boiled over. "I have to go talk to him," Lucas muttered to himself, his voice shaky. He didn't want to, but he couldn't just sit in the car forever. Maybe the man could explain what was going on. Or maybe this was just a strange coincidence. Either way, he needed answers. Taking a deep breath, Lucas opened the door and stepped out into the rain. The cold droplets soaked through his jacket immediately, but he barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the figure by the door. Each step felt heavier as he walked across the gravel lot, his shoes crunching beneath him. The wind howled softly, as if warning him to turn back. As he got closer to the station, the attendant's face came into clearer view. He looked exactly the same as before, same worn-out uniform, same hollow expression. But now, there was something else in his eyes, a glint of recognition, almost as if he had been waiting for Lucas all along. "Back again, huh?" the attendant said, his voice calm but with an unsettling edge. Lucas stopped a few feet away from him, swallowing hard. What is going on?" he asked, his voice barely louder than the rain. "I drove for hours, but I ended up back here. How is that even possible?" The attendant didn't answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if considering his response. Finally, he spoke, his words deliberate and measured. "You didn't drive far at all, friend. You've been going in circles. That road, it doesn't lead anywhere." Lucas's stomach dropped. The way the man said it, with such certainty, sent a chill through his bones. "What do you mean it doesn't lead anywhere? I've been on that highway for hours. There's got to be an exit or a town or something up ahead." The attendant shook his head slowly. "Nope, not for you at least." He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Lucas's. "This place, it's not like the rest of the world. Once you stop here, you're part of it. You can't just drive away." Lucas took a step back, panic bubbling in his chest. "That's insane. I don't belong here. I'm just passing through on my way home." The attendant's lips curled into a faint, almost pitying smile. "You may not have intended to stop here, but the road has its own way of pulling people in. And once you're here, well, you're stuck, at least, until you figure it out." "Figure what out?" Lucas demanded, his frustration boiling over. "What the hell are you talking about?" The attendant's expression darkened. "You're caught in a loop, same as everyone who's ever stopped here. You've been down this road before, even if you don't remember it. The reason you came back, it's because you didn't learn the last time." Lucas's mind reeled. None of this made any sense. "What do you mean, last time? I've never been here before." The attendant's gaze hardened. "Haven't you?" For a long, agonizing moment, Lucas stood there in the rain, staring at the man who seemed to know far more about his situation than he was letting on. His thoughts were racing, trying to piece together what was happening, but nothing fit. Before Lucas could say anything else, the attendant stepped forward again, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "I told you once before to turn back, to leave. You didn't listen then, and you're not listening now." Lucas's pulse quickened. There was something deeply wrong with this man, something beyond explanation. His skin prickled with fear, but beneath that, a creeping realization began to take hold. "What are you saying?" Lucas asked, his voice barely audible over the rain. "That I've been trapped here before. And you're trying to warn me again?" The attendant's smile returned, but this time it was darker, filled with resignation. "I'm not just warning you. I'm showing you what happens if you don't change." Lucas stared at him, the weight of the words sinking in, but before he could respond, the attendant did something that made Lucas's blood turn to ice. He reached up and pulled off his cap, revealing a face that was all too familiar. It was Lucas's own. Staring back at him was a version of himself, older, worn down by time and desperation, but undeniably him. The reflection in front of him stood still, expression grim but calm, as if this revelation were something inevitable. Lucas staggered backward, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. No, this isn't possible. This can't be happening." His doppelganger, the attendant, stepped forward one last time, his voice firm. "You've been running in circles, Lucas. Every choice you've made has brought you back here. You have to break the cycle. You have to listen this time." Lucas's mind was unraveling. How could this be real? Was he trapped in some kind of nightmare, doomed to repeat the same journey over and over? The road, the gas station, his own reflection, it all twisted in his head like a cruel joke. "Why me?" Lucas whispered, his voice trembling. The reflection of himself offered no comfort. "Because it's always been you." Lucas stood there, drenched in rain, his mind spinning with disbelief and fear. The revelation that the gas station attendant was a future version of himself was impossible to process. Every nerve in his body screamed for him to run, to escape this madness. But where would he go? Back onto the endless road. The idea of continuing forward seemed futile now. His doppelganger, his future self, watched him with a resigned look, almost pitying. But there was something more behind those eyes, understanding, perhaps even hope. "You're trapped, Lucas," the reflection said, stepping closer, his voice steady. "Just like I was. We all are. Until we break the cycle." Lucas backed away, shaking his head. "This isn't real. This has to be some kind of sick hallucination." His future self frowned. "Denying it won't change anything. You can't keep running from the truth." The cold realization gripped Lucas, forcing him to confront the unthinkable. His mind raced as fragments of memories. Things he had dismissed as déjà vu began to surface. The road, the stop, the rain. He had felt this before. But how? "What is this place?" Lucas demanded, his voice louder now, desperate. "Why am I stuck here? What does it want from me?" His reflection didn't respond immediately, as if considering the weight of the question. Then he sighed, his voice soft but firm. "It's not the road or the gas station that's keeping you here, Lucas, it's you." Lucas froze, not understanding. "Not." "What do you mean it's me?" "You're stuck because you keep making the same choices," his future self said, taking another step closer. "You refuse to face what's really holding you back. Each time, you run into this same roadblock, and each time, you end up right back here, unable to escape." Lucas clenched his fists, anger flaring. "That's not true. I don't even know what I'm supposed to be facing. How can I change something I don't understand?" His future self looked at him sadly, as though he'd heard these words before. "Deep down you do know. You just haven't accepted it yet." The cryptic words hung in the air, and Lucas felt the pressure mounting. What was he supposed to accept? What was he running from? He searched his mind frantically, trying to find answers in the fog of his confusion, but nothing made sense. Then, a memory struck him, sharp and sudden, a flash of his mother's funeral, the weight of regret he had carried ever since. He had been distant, closed off from his family in the weeks leading up to her death. He hadn't been there when she needed him most. That guilt, that unresolved pain, had gnawed at him for years, but he had buried it deep, refusing to confront the emotions that came with it. Was this the key? Was he being forced to relive this endless loop because he had never faced that moment? No, Lucas whispered to himself, the weight of the realization sinking in. It can't be that. But his future self nodded, confirming his worst fears. It's always been about that. Every time you try to move forward, you end up stuck in the past, trapped by your guilt. Until you face it, you'll keep coming back here. Lucas stumbled backward, his legs feeling weak as the enormity of the truth hit him like a wave. The road, the gas station, the endless cycle, it was all tied to his inability to confront his pain, his failure to forgive himself for the way he had handled his mother's death. He looked at the version of himself standing before him, older and worn down by the same burden. Was this his fate if he didn't change? Would he be doomed to relive this journey forever, never able to escape his own mind? There's got to be a way out, Lucas said, his voice a mix of desperation and resolve. How do I break the cycle? His future self stepped closer until they were almost face to face. You already know how. You have to let go. You have to forgive yourself, or this road will never end. Lucas's chest tightened as he tried to process the enormity of what he was being asked to do. Could he truly forgive himself for what had happened? Could he let go of the guilt that had consumed him for so long? His future self watched him, waiting, as though this were the moment of decision. I don't know if I can, Lucas admitted, his voice barely a whisper. You can, his reflection said firmly. You have to. For a moment, everything was still. The rain, the wind, even the flickering neon sign seemed to pause, as if the world were holding its breath. Lucas closed his eyes, breathing deeply as he forced himself to face the truth. His mother's face flashed in his mind, not the image of her at the end, but of her smile, the warmth she had shown him despite everything. She had always been forgiving, even when he had shut himself off, even when he had failed to be there for her. I'm sorry, Lucas whispered to the memory, his heart heavy but full of resolve. I'm sorry I wasn't there. The words hung in the air, a release of the weight he had carried for so long, and for the first time, Lucas felt a sense of peace washing over him. It was subtle at first, but it grew, spreading through his chest and loosening the grip of guilt that had held him captive. When he opened his eyes, his reflection smiled, a real smile, filled with understanding. You did it, the future Lucas said softly. Lucas blinked, the world around him seeming brighter, less oppressive. The rain had slowed, the wind had calmed, and when he looked around, the gas station no longer felt like a trap. Is it over? Lucas asked, his voice cautious but hopeful. His future self nodded. It is. You've broken the loop. Lucas stood in the rain, the remnants of the endless loop fading into the background as the weight of his confession settled within him. He had broken the cycle, but what now? His future self, the strange and haunting figure who had guided him to this point, was still standing before him, watching with the same patient expression. You're free now, his future self said softly, but you still have to move forward. The words echoed in Lucas's mind. The endless road he had been trapped on was no longer a threat, but the journey wasn't over. He glanced back at the gas station, the once eerie, dilapidated structure, now seeming less menacing, almost ordinary. The lights flickered gently, casting a soft glow on the wet pavement, but the overwhelming sense of dread had lifted. Lucas turned back to his future self, questions swirling in his mind. What happens to you? Now that the loop is broken, what happens? His future self smiled, a bittersweet expression crossing his face. I've played my part. I don't exist beyond this. You've made the choice I couldn't, and now you get to live." The realization hit Lucas like a punch to the gut. His future self, the version of him that had been trapped for so long, was about to disappear. He had been the final remnant of the cycle, the ghost of Lucas's unresolved past. "Will you just fade away?" Lucas asked, his voice trembling with an unexpected sense of loss. His reflection chuckled, the sound lighter than before. "Something like that, but don't worry about me. I was never really meant to exist beyond this. You were always the one in control, Lucas. You just didn't know it." Lucas nodded, though the weight of the moment still bore down on him. He had spent so long running, avoiding the truth, that the idea of facing a world without the loop felt foreign. But as he stood there, with the rain lightly falling and the world around him returning to normal, he realized something important. He wasn't afraid anymore. "I think I'm ready," Lucas said, his voice steady. His future self nodded, the smile still lingering. "Then go. The road is yours now." Lucas took a deep breath and turned toward his car. It sat there, waiting, no longer a vessel trapped in an endless journey. He could drive away now. He could leave the gas station, leave the loop, and return to the life he had avoided for so long. As he opened the door, he glanced back one last time. His future self stood by the gas station, watching with a calm expression, slowly fading into the mist. "Thank you," Lucas whispered, though he wasn't sure if the figure could hear him. And then, with a sense of finality, he climbed into the car and closed the door. The engine roared to life, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Lucas felt a sense of direction. The road stretched ahead, no longer the endless void it had been, but a path he could follow to somewhere new. As he drove, the rain began to lighten, the storm clouds breaking apart to reveal a sky just beginning to clear. He drove in silence, reflecting on everything that had happened. His mind wandered to his family, the people he had distanced himself from after his mother's death. He thought about the missed moments, the times he had chosen not to reach out, but now he had a chance to make it right. The road stretched on, but Lucas felt no fear. The darkness had lifted, and with it, the weight of his guilt. He wasn't sure what waited for him on the other side, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to find out. After what felt like hours, the familiar lights of a town appeared on the horizon. Lucas's heart lifted as he recognized the signs leading him back towards civilization. He wasn't trapped anymore. The endless road had given way to reality, and soon he would be home. As he pulled into the small town, Lucas parked on the side of the road, the hum of the engine dying down as he sat there, staring at the world in front of him. People passed by, cars moved along the streets, and everything felt so normal. For a moment, Lucas simply sat there, soaking in the peace of the moment. It felt surreal, as though everything that had happened at the gas station had been a dream. But it hadn't been. The loop was real. The future version of himself had been real. And now, the choice to move forward was real. Lucas took a deep breath, pulling out his phone. He stared at the screen for a moment, his finger hovering over the call button as he debated what to do next. His family was expecting him. He had been on his way to see them for the holidays when all of this had started. And now, after everything, he realized how much he wanted to see them again, not out of obligation or guilt, but because he truly missed them. With a newfound sense of purpose, Lucas hit the call button, listening to the ringing on the other end. After a few moments, a familiar voice answered. "Lucas, is that you?" He smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "Yeah, it's me. I'm on my way home." As the call ended, Lucas leaned back in his seat, the weight of everything finally lifting off his shoulders. The road had been long, the journey difficult, but he had made it through. He had broken the loop, faced his guilt, and now he was free. The sun began to break through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the town as Lucas started the car again and pulled back onto the road. This time he wasn't running. This time he was driving towards something better. The future was his, and for the first time in a long time, Lucas felt like he was ready to face it. Lucas continued driving through the quiet town, the familiarity of the place grounding him after the surreal experience he had endured. The lights of small shops flickered as the town gradually woke up, people bustling around, starting their day. He smiled slightly at the ordinary scene, appreciating the simplicity of life that he had taken for granted for so long. As he followed the main road leading out of the town, the weight of his past choices slowly melted away. The fog in his mind cleared, and for the first time, Lucas felt like he was heading in the right direction, both on the road and in his life. His phone buzzed beside him, and he glanced at the screen. A message from his sister appeared. "Can't wait to see you. Drive safe." Lucas's heart lifted. He had avoided these simple, heartfelt messages for too long. He was ready to reconnect with his family, to rebuild the bridges he had carelessly burned. He quickly replied with a short but meaningful message. "I'm almost there." The countryside stretched out in front of him, open and inviting. The last remnants of the storm had passed, leaving the sky clear and painted with soft morning light. The air felt fresh, the scenery calming. It was hard to believe that just a few hours ago, he had been trapped in a nightmarish loop of endless driving, unable to escape the same stretch of road. The miles rolled by, and with each one, Lucas felt more and more free. He thought back to the gas station, the dilapidated structure, the strange and cryptic attendant who had turned out to be him. It was a mind-bending experience, but one that had forced him to confront the harsh truth he had been running from for so long. Lucas had learned that guilt, when left unaddressed, could trap a person in a cycle of avoidance and denial. But he had broken free. He had faced his past and accepted the pain of it. That acceptance had been the key to his escape, not just from the endless road, but from the emotional prison he had built around himself after his mother's death. Up ahead, a familiar sign appeared, the turnoff to his family's home. Lucas slowed the car as he neared the junction, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. He hadn't seen his sister and father in years. The guilt over his mother's death had kept him away. But now, things would be different. He turned onto the narrow country road that led to the house, the sight of the winding path bringing back memories of his childhood. He could almost hear his mother's laughter, the warmth of family dinners, the sense of belonging that had once been so strong. Finally, the house came into view. It was a modest, cozy home nestled in a grove of trees. Lucas parked the car in the gravel driveway and sat there for a moment, taking it all in. This was the moment he had been dreading and longing for. He had come full circle, returning not just to a playtime but to the people he had shut out for too long. Lucas stepped out of the car, his feet crunching on the gravel as he walked toward the front door. Before he could knock, the door swung open and his sister stood there, a look of disbelief and joy on her face. "Lucas, you're really here," she said, her voice soft with emotion. He smiled, his heart full. "I'm here. I'm really here." They embraced, the weight of the years apart dissolving in that moment. Lucas felt a sense of peace wash over him, knowing that he had finally made the right choice. His family, the love he had been avoiding, was right here waiting for him. As they walked into the house together, Lucas glanced back one last time, half expecting to see the eerie gas station in the distance or his future self standing in the shadows. But there was nothing, only the calm, quiet countryside and the promise of a new beginning. Lucas stepped inside the house, the warmth of the familiar space enveloping him. The soft hum of the heater and the faint smell of freshly brewed coffee brought back memories of countless mornings spent here. His sister, Julia, led him into the kitchen where their father sat at the table, reading the newspaper. The years had added lines to his face, but he still had the same quiet strength Lucas remembered. Their father looked up, and for a moment, the room was heavy with unspoken words. Lucas swallowed, unsure of how to start, but before he could say anything, his father stood and walked over to him. The silence stretched, and then, unexpectedly, his father pulled him into a hug. Lucas felt his breath catch in his throat as he returned the embrace, the guilt and shame that had kept him away easing just a little. "I'm glad you're home, son," his father said, his voice gruff but filled with emotion. Lucas nodded, his chest tight with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "I should have come sooner. I'm sorry." His father pulled back and looked him in the eye. "You're here now. That's what matters." They sat down at the table, the air lighter now. Julia poured Lucas a cup of coffee, and they began talking, tentatively at first, but soon the conversation flowed more easily. They shared stories, laughed about old memories, and for the first time in years, Lucas felt like he belonged again. Hours passed, and as the sun began to set, Lucas found himself sitting on the porch, watching the fading light. Julia and their father were inside, preparing dinner, but Lucas needed a moment alone to process everything. He thought back to the gas station, to the strange encounter with his future self. It had felt like a warning, a test, something otherworldly, guiding him back to where he needed to be. But now, sitting on his family's porch, he realized that it wasn't just about avoiding an accident or a tragic fate. It was about facing his own demons, confronting the choices he had made, and finding a way to move forward. The wind rustled through the trees, and Lucas smiled to himself. He had been given a second chance, a chance to reconnect with his family, to forgive himself, and to finally live without the weight of the past holding him back. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Lucas stood and walked back inside, ready to embrace whatever came next. If you liked it, comment below, like and subscribe.